Good afternoon, everybody. It's Dr. Lee, and today I'm going to cover substance use disorders in the DSM-5 and then broadly go over what is an addiction and how is it different from substance use. For some of you, this set of disorders in this discussion will strike close to home. Addiction and substance use problems are very common, whether we experience them ourselves or if we watch a loved one struggle with one. But this is very much a set of disorders and concerns that is very common. And as a counselor, you will certainly come across a client who's struggling with substance use, abuse, addiction, or a family member who is struggling watching a loved one struggle with the same. So hopefully this is helpful. Think of this in terms of not only diagnosing but also how we work with addiction and how we can explain it to our clients and the family members of those clients. So let's dive in. So just take a second and think about what is addiction. That's a term that we throw around a lot, kind of like I'm so ADHD, I'm OCD about this, I'm addicted to chocolate. You hear in the news a lot about different types of addiction, right? Addiction to cocaine, alcohol. There's the behavioral addictions, right? Like sex addiction, food addiction, exercise addiction. But really, what does it mean? And what are the key ingredients for addiction? Now, some of you are probably accurately thinking an addiction is someone who keeps using even though they keep finding consequences or an inability to stop. And those are both accurate answers. But what else? There's a little bit more to it than that. So the main ingredients needed for addiction include tolerance, withdrawal, lack of control, effects on intent, time, fewer outside activities, and then the biggest red flag of all, continued use despite consequences. See, I told you you guys were right. So what is tolerance? So in short, the person needs more of whatever the substance is to achieve the desired effect. So take someone who maybe at 21, they waited, and they have their first drink, and one shot or one beer or one glass of wine got them where they wanted to go. And then it kind of creeps up to, I need 2, and then 3, and then 4, and so on, right? It might be that a person only needed a little bit of Xanax, which notoriously builds up tolerance very quickly. One bar or one pill would be enough, and then it very quickly leads to 1.5, then 2, and so on. And so, good counseling question, good practical one, is asking people, how much do you typically drink? And there are people who do have naturally high tolerances. That's why we want to get a baseline. So if there was someone who naturally has a high tolerance, that's fine. That was their baseline. That's where they started. But it can still increase. If someone said, right out of the box, I could handle 6 shots and not feel a thing, then fine. What are you doing now? And now they say, well, now I need 12 to get where I want to go, right? So that's still tolerance. It's just the bottom was a little bit higher. And so tolerance is really important. It kind of gives you a little bit of a history. So when did you start drinking? When was the first time you had too much to drink? Have you ever blacked out, passed out, so on? And tolerance comes in 2 varieties. There's metabolic, which is just like you probably think of it, which is your body gets really good at processing it. So the high or the effect doesn't last as long. And there's pharmacological or pharmacokinetic tolerance, which is the central nervous system is adjusting to getting that substance so much so the person gets less bang for the buck, right? So it may have been that a little bit of cocaine went a long way, and then the next time it wasn't as much. So you see this a lot, for example, with ecstasy, where the first time someone uses it is the most pleasurable time. It's the time where they have the biggest high, and then subsequent times is less and less and less. And what's happening is the body's getting very good at processing it out, so it's not lasting as long. And the central nervous system for things like cocaine and heroin and all of that is it just doesn't stimulate it as much. So what does this mean in behavioral terms? It means that the person is using higher amounts more frequently. Withdrawal, another term that everybody has probably heard. So this is the hangover, right? This is the after effect. So without the thing, without the substance or the behavior, the person feels discomfort. And I italicize that because discomfort is this big umbrella term, because it would encapsulate things like feeling angry, anxious, sick, uncomfortable, whatever it might be. But there is some negative part, and what has happened is the person's body has adjusted to having this substance, and now it's depleted, and now the body is kind of out of equilibrium and it's trying to get back. So waking up with that hangover, the body aches, the bone aches, the chills, the nauseousness, it's the body saying, whoa, there was this thing that was supporting us and now it's gone and we feel awful. Lack of control, right? So an inability to stop or reduce using, right? And this is a red flag, right? Tolerance, people develop tolerance, right? Think about, although I'm sure nobody here has partied out of control, but think about your own experiences, like where you started, maybe when you first started drinking to later on, it probably increased a little bit. Withdrawal, people have, the next day woken up feeling heavy-headed, maybe sick, maybe tired, a little achy, right? Those things happen. I'm not minimizing it. But lack of control, when someone comes and they say, I've tried to stop and it's just really hard, or you ask that question, have you ever tried to cut back? And they say, I've tried, but it's really difficult. That, for you, should kind of raise an eyebrow in the sense of, okay, maybe this is more than someone who's just having a little too much fun. Effects on intent, similar to the previous slide, many times people, especially when they start hovering around the idea of maybe I have a problem or this is getting out of hand, is, I'll only have a glass of wine, or, with gambling addiction, I will only bet $50, and when the $50 is gone, I'll leave the casino. I'll only drink on the weekends, things like that. And that becomes very difficult because one drink becomes two, becomes three, or the rationalizing, it was a really hard day, or, well, what's another $10? Time. So, good question that, you don't see often in textbooks and things like that, but that really opens up a lot of dialogue with clients, is talking about the amount of time the person spends doing whatever the substance is, right? And so this would include preparing to use, right? So I spent time trying to get the money, getting ready, finding a source, doing this, using, and then recovery. And when you put it all together, that can be an eye-opener for your client, and for you, it's good clinical information to help show, like, hey, a lot of your time in the week is just geared around this. And some of you might be thinking, but really, do people do that? Like, don't people just have jobs and they have money? And no, like, there are people who will spend time, like, think of street drugs, right? Or illegal drugs, right? It's spending time to get the money to do that, securing a location to do it. Maybe you can't do it at your home, or even drinking, using whatever, and you get to the point where the withdrawal is so great that you now need to take a day off. So when you line up the total amount of time spent, right, it's not just, so I went out partying for 2 hours, but then it took me another 24 hours to kind of bounce back, and I had to call out of work, right? So asking about the amount of time that's spent doing that, and also on top of that, the amount of time spent thinking about it, right? So I've worked with clients who, they look, we all live for the weekend. I get it. They're just counting down until I can have a drink. So most of their thought and cognitive energy is going towards that. Fewer other activities, right? There's only so much time in the day. And like I said, spending all that cognitive energy thinking about it means that here it might be I used to go to the gym, or I was an avid hiker, or I used to do art, and that becomes less and less and less because I really just want to feel good or feel less bad. And so really I'm just kind of living to get high. And then the biggest one of all, the continued use despite consequences, right? So I know we keep getting into fights. Every vacation is ruined. My partner's threatening to leave me, and I keep doing it, right? So that's a big red flag. What happens with addiction a lot is that, you know, people make mistakes, and you or someone getting high or drunk and making a mistake, and I'm not minimizing those mistakes, doesn't inherently mean that they have an addiction. But if they keep making the same mistake over and over, so I use the example of, think of a college student who's 18, goes to a party in the dorm, party happens to get busted by police, and the student gets a minor in possession, right? So they get a ticket, they get kicked out of the dorm, they broke the rules, so they had a consequence. But we would expect that person to maybe learn from it, and so maybe not put themselves in that position to wait till they're 21, or if they got a DUI or DWI, and again, I'm certainly not minimizing that, you know, that's a very serious mistake. They make some poor choices. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have an addiction. If they did it again and again and again, then we start seeing it. Or if one relationship failed because of drug use, and then the next relationship failed because of drug use, right? It's that continued behavior despite those consequences. So how does one get to addiction? And there is so much literature on addiction. I'm happy to provide resources. This is a really interesting field for counselors. And it's a very serious issue. It's a very common issue, but there's lots of ways to work with addiction. And what's really helpful is to explain to clients and to their loved ones or their support, how did this addiction get here? The short answer is brain stuff. You like that? So the brain, it does all the work. All psychoactive drugs alter feelings, thoughts, and behavior, and it does that by changing things in the brain, whether it be, the neurotransmission, the addition of excitotrons, messing with the neurotransmitters. It deals with the plasticity of the brain, so it changes stuff by affecting the brain and the brain processes. So here's a nice model of the brain, right, from Nita. And there's two pathways that come up a lot with addiction. The reward pathway, which is the I want to feel good pathway, right? As the cool kids say, I want this to be fire. And the inhibitory pathway is I want to feel less bad, right? Like, I'm hurting, I'm miserable, and this sort of dulls those thoughts. So our reward pathway, which we'll focus on primarily, is comprised of the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, and prefrontal cortex, right? And so that prefrontal cortex is what's responsible for self-regulation and monitoring, abstract thinking, social behavior, and moral behavior. And that's where, when we see, especially like on TV, when you see the very serious cases, which are not far off from the truth when you watch the documentaries, where people are, they're selling family heirlooms, they're doing illegal things to get high, because this has diminished, and so this has gone out the window, right? And so really it's, I want to do whatever I need to do to feel better. And also the discomfort that's experienced from the withdrawal can be so intense of like, yeah, I'm willing to sell, my family's belongings to get high again. So here's a diagram again, our prefrontal cortex, the nucleus, and the VTA is over here. And so when activated by a rewarding stimulus, right, like you get food, you eat chocolate, right, or something salty or fatty, right, so think of like when I was talking about binge eating disorder, right, that triggers a whole bunch of stuff in the brain, and we get the release of neurotransmitters, the feel-good chemicals, and it goes from the VTA to the nucleus to the prefrontal cortex, right? And if you do that enough times, that association, that pathway, that neural pathway in the brain forms more and more. It's kind of like how the Grand Canyon was made, right? It's very slow. That conditioning is there, but if you do anything enough times, a hard pathway is going to be moved where it's like, hey, we're going to take advantage of this, and then it becomes very associated with the drug or the behavior on top of all the chemical effects. So I said a minute ago, neurotransmission, and that's important to understand. So this is kind of how the drugs work. So neurotransmission is the process of relaying information in the brain, right? And one way of communicating is through the chemical substances that our body naturally produces. These are neurotransmitters. One of those is called dopamine, and that's important to remember. Dopamine is what's responsible for feeling good, for euphoria, right? So when you had a long day and you get out your ice cream, and I'll use me as an example. When I get out my ice cream and I eat it and I taste it, the brain is releasing that dopamine, and I feel good. And that's how it works. When we're having a good time, it releases it. When a person gets high, it stimulates those same processes. When a person has sex, they eat the food they like, they do something fun, they're happy, dopamine is released. Very few cells create dopamine, but it's a very influential neurotransmitter. And what happens is that when a person takes certain drugs, such as cocaine, and that'll be the example we use in a few slides, or for a few slides, it blocks neurons so that the dopamine builds up. It stays there longer. So in a normal, healthy communication process in the brain, a neuron releases dopamine, and there's little spaces between neurons. These are called synapses. And one neuron will kind of pitch, think of it that way, they'll pitch the dopamine, they'll release it. And that dopamine will bind with a receptor, and it signals to that neuron, feel good. So here's a little example. So here's our neuron, right? Neuron 1. Here's the other neuron that it's talking to. These little gray guys are our dopamine. And so these are the chemical messengers. This one is saying, feel good. This one's like, okay. And then if we have cocaine, which we'll go into in a second, it can kind of, it changes the way they communicate. I think this is an artist's rendition of a synapse. But here's one synapse, here's one neuron, here's the synapse, right, the space, here's our receptor. This neuron is going to release this dopamine, which would bind here, right? And that feels good, that feels nice. So nice. So what you're going to see in a second is how the dopamine goes back and forth, right? It's not always out to feel good. That's why we don't always feel good all of the time, right? So here, the dopamine's released. It goes here. See how the dopamine is on this receptor. And then the dopamine goes back, right, to this transporter, right? So it goes back and forth. When appropriate, right? So you did something pleasurable. I ate the ice cream. I had the salty food. I went to the gym. I feel really good. The brain is saying, release the feel-goods, and it's going back and forth, and that's what's making me feel good. So now, drugs interfere with that process, right? it blocks, cocaine for example, blocks the reuptake, the removal of the dopamine, right? And that causes all that dopamine to build up more and more. In otherwise healthy brain communication, what's happening is the neuron releases this and it stays for a little while and then it eventually gets picked back up, right? Your brain's not letting that dopamine just be out here all the time or any particularly great abundance unless the situation calls for it, right? But this is a process and these pieces go back home. When cocaine is around though, or other drugs, it blocks these transporters. It prevents the reuptake. So all this dopamine is staying there, and that's feeling better and better and better. It feels really good. Look at all this dopamine versus here, right? All this dopamine's here. It's staying there. It's not getting picked back up. So it's just lingering around, and that causes the euphoric feeling. So for this reward pathway, that's what happens. People get high. That's, neurobiologically what's happening. It's increasing the dopamine and letting it hang out longer, which feels really good. And then that person is experiencing the high. In practice, why does this matter? Because some of you, when I went to grad school, I had no conceptualization of addiction. So when you hear about this neurobiological aspect, there might be a part of you that wonders, so what? That's how it works. Does it really change what's going on with my client? This is still a person who's struggling with substance abuse. And the answer is that it's helpful because it helps other people, including your client, understand what addiction is. And it's not as simple as saying they have no self-control or they're a lush or they're a bad person, right? That's way too overly reductionistic and judgy and things like that. Explaining to the person that there are these mechanical pieces and there's a mechanical process going on that is facilitating the substance use can help remove a lot of burden from your client and can help family members feel maybe a little bit more receptive to the idea that their loved one is not, this horrible person that just values drinking or drugs or behavior over them, that there's something neurologically that's happening. And so it also helps us be more empathic with clients that this is hard, right? This is a thing that takes time to change. And if a normal part of addictions work is relapse and resistance, and it helps us as clinicians to better understand that. So, and if you want more information on neurobiology and addiction, please let me know. There's the other video I posted for this section. But if you want more information, let me know. There's tons of really great information to the point where it can kind of be overwhelming. But if you need a sort of a direction to go in, I'm happy to help out. So let's pivot into the DSM, right? So we've kind of set the stage for what is an addiction. And by no means am I suggesting that that's everything about addiction. That's just kind of the broad strokes to get us going in the right direction with the DSM. So the DSM-5 has 10 major classes of substances. It includes alcohol, caffeine. What do y'all think about caffeine? That's a new one for DSM-5. They've now included caffeine as a substance of abuse. A lot of us are probably thinking, oh God, this is speaking to me. Weed, hallucinogens, I got a typo. Inhalants, opioids, sedatives, stimulants, tobacco, and other, right? Unfortunately, new drugs will always be made, or there might be some other drug that just didn't fit into these other categories, and so they leave that open in case you work with a client that has something that they're using that doesn't quite fit in there. And there are two types of substance-induced disorders: intoxication and withdrawal. So think for a second, where would you be working that you had a client come to your session presently intoxicated or in withdrawal. Well, chances are this would probably be like a rehab facility or a substance abuse facility, a hospital, or a community agency. I've had a few clients come in who they were obviously high or drunk, and it's something to think about, especially for those of you that think about going to private practices. How do you want to address that situation? But the DSM does recognize substance intoxication and substance withdrawal as substance disorders. For intoxication, for substance, intoxication, the DSM describes it as it's reversible. They have a set of symptoms, a syndrome, due to the recent ingestion of the substance, and that they have a behavioral or psychological change that's problematic. And the symptoms are not explained by another mental disorder. Again, you see that with everything. For withdrawal, it's that the person has problematic behavioral or physiological changes due to the recent cessation or reduction of use. So the person maybe was using something, this is an extreme example, but was using heroin and then stopped, and now they hit that crash where they feel awful, right? But we're attributing all that awfulness to the stopping of the heroin, right? And that's causing a lot of distress and problems. The symptoms for the substance use disorders, and so that's the DSM doesn't ever say addiction, right? We wouldn't diagnose somebody with like alcohol addiction, but we would say alcohol use disorder. And for each of these substances, you'll see that they have alcohol use disorder, aka addiction or dependence, alcohol intoxication, alcohol withdrawal. Same with the rest of these. Cannabis, like weed use disorder, or they would say cannabis. Cannabis use disorder, cannabis intoxication, cannabis withdrawal. And the symptoms for those include these 4 different categories: impaired control, social impairment, risky use, and pharmacological concerns. For impaired control, so taking a larger amount of substance or over a longer period than planned, so that's our tolerance. Multiple unsuccessful attempts to stop or reduce. Spends a great deal of time obtaining, using, or recovering from the substances, and cravings. So this is impaired control. Social impairment. Recurrent use results in a consequence, whether it's at work, school, or home, right? So at work, I had to call out, or I went to work high. At school, I failed or missed a test. At home, it's, my partner saying they're going to leave me, or my parents are going to kick me out of the house. Continued use despite those issues. And other recreational activities have been given up. Risky use. So recurrent use in situations that are hazardous, so drinking and driving, right? Drinking on the job. Continued use despite knowledge of physical or psychological problems, right? So maybe they're told by a physician, you have fatty liver disease, or you got an infection from needle use, or this is causing cognitive impairments, and the person continues to use. And pharmacological grouping, tolerance again, and withdrawal. The specifiers for severity are the same across all of the substances. So you're always going to diagnose at a minimum mild, which is the presence of 2 to 3. They essentially made the baseline for the diagnosis. Moderate would be 4 to 5 symptoms, and severe would be 6 or more symptoms. That's going to do it for the addictions video. But before I just wanted to pull this up so that you kind of have an idea of what it looks like. So let's look at alcohol, for example. So each disorder will have its own little mini section. So we have one for alcohol, there would be one for caffeine, for cannabis. So alcohol use disorder, that is the addiction, right? That is the dependent disorder. A pattern of behavior with alcohol, so with the substance, manifested by at least 2 of the following within 1 year. So all those symptoms that we just went over are here, right? Taken as a larger amount, unsuccessful efforts to cut down, the time, the craving, recurrent use, etc., etc., etc. We have a couple remission specifiers. In controlled environment means if they're in a like a substance abuse facility, right, or a prison or a hospital. And again, mild, and you see how the code changes here. Mild, 2 to 3 symptoms. Moderate, 4 to 5. Severe, 6 or more. We go down a little bit. Here's all your information about it. Alcohol intoxication. Withdrawal. And then we're on to the caffeine section. Notice that it has caffeine intoxication. So this is caffeine sickness, like if you've had too much and you kind of made yourself dizzy or sick. Caffeine withdrawal. I want y'all to think about what do y'all think about caffeine being included? They consider a high dose 250 milligrams. I think a 8-ounce cup of coffee is like 200. And I'm willing to bet I'm not the only one who does not drink 8 ounces. Cannabis, so cannabis addiction, cannabis intoxication, cannabis withdrawal, right? And you'll see that the criteria are the same. 2 of the following within 12 months. Taken in larger amounts, try to cut back, time, craving, consequences, recurrent use and physically hazardous times, remission, environment, and severity. Right? So this is the same for each of the substances. The only thing I caution is to not rush to it, right? Talk to your client and try and figure out, is this really a problem or was this, maybe a poor decision, right? Made a bad decision to, drink and drive, or got too drunk or too high and said things they regret, right? People make mistakes. That doesn't automatically make it an addiction, but it certainly puts that on the radar for a possibility. So you take a nice history. Have you ever tried to cut back? Have you ever had other problems with this? Have your friends and family, have you ever gotten annoyed because people told you drink too much or use too much? Have you ever needed to drink first thing in the morning or get high first thing in the morning, right? So those are all great questions to talk to your client about to help establish, is this an addiction or was this maybe poor decision making, right? A mistake. Well, that's it for today. I hope this was helpful. Check out the other video from Nita. It goes over more of the neurobiology stuff, and that information is really helpful for us to conceptualize what our client's going through and to also help explain to them what's happening, because more often than not, your client will come in or the family will come in and you will be the first person to explain to them what is an addiction, and that this is not so much a moral issue or a personality issue as it is a neurobiological issue. I hope everyone's well, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.